Several years ago, I had a young person who lived in a small town, and on a Friday night, he and a friend were at a local hamburger place. They ran into an athlete from their school. They did not particularly know him as a friend, but they knew who he was. And the young athlete approached them and asked them for a ride home. Being nice young men, they agreed to give him a ride to his home. This was approximately 11:30 at night. These young men were driving a fairly nice car. They took this young man home, and he lived in a very disadvantaged area of town, in a housing complex. And here is this kind of fancy car pulling into this apartment complex, and they were of a different racial mix, and they dropped this young man off and said goodnight to him. This was an act of kindness, an act of camaraderie among students, but they let the young man off. As they were pulling out of the complex, a police officer spotted them. He saw them go in and knew they'd only been there for about 5 minutes. He found that to be suspicious. And I want you to understand that generally people will accuse you of what they would be guilty of under those circumstances. That doesn't mean it's true. And what this police officer deduced was that was a drug deal. These young men had no business being there. And that's an assumption of the worst, which many people do. The thought that they were there on an act of mercy or kindness didn't cross his mind. He pulled these two young men over. He thought they were drug dealers. He searched their car. In fact, there was a small bag of marijuana under each of the seats in the front of the car. The passenger side and the driver's side each had a small bag of marijuana. He charged both boys. The driver of the car subsequently pled guilty without representation. I represented the passenger, and he told me repeatedly that was not his marijuana. He didn't know. Well, certainly you can assume 2 kids, 2 bags of marijuana, each under their seat. They both had illegal drugs. I struggled to find the theme in that case because my common sense and assumptions would be they each had drugs. And I struggled immensely. On the way to the trial, I rode by a restaurant, and they had a band playing that night. And the name of the band was Guilt by Association. That became the theme in this case. Now, the odd thing is the law in South Carolina says it is illegal to possess marijuana. There's not a lot of exceptions to that. And what the law basically states is if you're a law enforcement officer and it is evidence, you can possess marijuana as evidence. But that's about it. What happened in this trial is the prosecutor walked around with this bag of marijuana. He showed it to the jury. He showed it to us. He showed it to the judge, and he left it laying on his table. Likewise, I picked up that bag of marijuana. I took it to the jury. I gave it to the first person on the jury, and I said, examine this, look at this. Each member of the jury handed the bag of marijuana to each other. When they were through, I left it on what's called the bar right in front of the jury. And part of my closing was, this is guilt by association. Mere presence does not mean guilt, because if you buy that concept, then each of you 6 jurors are guilty of possession of marijuana because you had it in your hands. And so would the prosecutor, and so am I. That possession of marijuana is the ability to exercise dominion and control over it, because if any of you had put it in your pocket, the police officer would have been there to take it back. You did not have that ability. That was the distinction in that case, and that's why the theme of guilt by association was critical, as in all cases.